Quantum Devil Saga, Avatar Tuner, Volume 1, by Yu Godai, translated by Kevin Frayne. The territories of the junkyard. Muladhara, held by the Embryon tribe and led by Surf. Svadhisthana, held by the Vanguards tribe and led by Harley Q. Manipura, held by the Maribel tribe and led by Jinana. Anahata, held by the Solids tribe and led by Mick the Slug. Vishuddha, held by the Wolves tribe and led by Canis Volk. Ajna, held by the Brutes tribe and led by Varin Omega. Sahasrara, the inviolate territory that holds the temple, the headquarters of the Church of the Arbiters of Karma. Part 1. The Junkyard. Time: 5:43:21 ST. Solar noise: Level 8. Coordinates: O2A7-7B77845. Scanning. Height: 3,567 millimeters. Length: 2,225 millimeters. Width: 2,225 millimeters. Weight: unknown. Material: unknown. Object: unknown. Retrying scan. Category: error. Chapter 1. We are the children of chaos, and the deep structure of change is decay. At root, there is only corruption and the unstemmable tide of chaos. P. W. Atkins. Surf froze. Someone was staring at him. He could feel it. There. He peered through the falling rain at a small creature perched on a nearby pile of rubble. It gazed back with bright eyes. Sheets of rain swept over them both. Silver rain. Tiny puddles of it rippled at Surf's feet, so metallic that the water looked like dancing mercury. All around him, twisted pieces of rusted metal jutted out of the ground. The rain washed across the battlefield. It had no weight to it, no warmth. It merely hung there, painting the air silver. In the distance loomed the spire of the temple. Right now it was ST, shaded time, and the sky was leaden gray, with an occasional flicker of green light visible only from the corner of the eye. Surf's forces and their opponents lay in wait in impromptu strongholds made of pitted slabs of concrete and overturned vehicles, facing off across this shattered no-man's land. The tribe suits they wore for combat were temperature-controlled, but they weren't meant for long-term engagements like this one. Surf had been stretching out his legs, trying to work out the stiffness in his muscles, but he paused at the feeling that someone was staring at him. Cat. The word flashed in his mind, but he didn't know what it meant. The screen of his scope glowed green, displaying the words category, error, over and over. He wasn't sure whether that reading came from the object up ahead that he'd just scanned, or from the thing that was staring at him from atop the rubble. Probably nothing to worry about. A moment later, whatever it was vanished, along with the message. The rain grew ever so slightly heavier. "Sir," his sniper said in a low voice. He looked over at her. "I've sighted Harley Q." Surf nodded and adjusted his scope's field of view, increasing its magnification to zoom in on the enemy forces deployed on the rise across the way. Ruined cityscapes formed a grim backdrop in the shadowy distance further beyond. The enemy was lurking in the cover provided by a scattered assortment of decaying buildings, indistinguishable hunks of concrete, and armored vehicles turned on their sides. The silver rain continued to pour down without a sound. Even with his eyes' low light spectral enhancement, it was difficult for him to detect the enemy's positions during an open-air engagement like this. But then, the enemy was in the same boat. They too had reinforced nervous systems and bolstered senses, but the dreary battlefield provided effective camouflage on every side. He switched over to thermal imaging mode, and red and orange silhouettes popped out against the field of gray. There they are. Surf contemplated the force that the vanguards had deployed. Data on their leader, Harley Q, was superimposed on one corner of his data display. He didn't see Harley himself yet, but if his sniper said he was there, then he was there. She had an unparalleled knack for spotting targets. She didn't even have to rely on scanning technology. Harley Q tended to prefer cautious guerrilla tactics. It was uncharacteristic of him to take such an openly aggressive course of action, which was precisely what made Surf uneasy. Uneasiness. That simply meant that some key piece of data was missing. The battlefield was a shallow basin. The uneven incline was littered with concrete debris and lumps of melted construction plastic that jutted out at odd angles across the field. In the middle were the remains of a highway overpass that had collapsed halfway along its length. Its darkened silhouette pierced the drab sky, marking the military border between Svadhisthana and Muladhara. On the near side of that line was a team of 40, and on the other, a team of about 60, both parties waiting for the signal to commence hostilities. The enemy had advanced down the slope to various points of cover provided by shipping containers, blocky remains of a long-abandoned structure, and other ruins. They appeared as indistinct blobs on the thermal scanner. Their voices were audible as a low murmur. From what Surf could see, each of the positions he'd spotted was manned by squads of 3 to 6 foot soldiers. He switched back to normal vision and looked around. Behind the enemy lines, he could see glimpses of green tribal markings in furtive motion. Each tribe wore uniforms marked with a unique color to differentiate itself from the rest. The vanguards wore outfits accented with vivid green markings, and their opponents, Surf's tribe, the Embryon, were marked by bright orange. Both stood out against the drab, gray scenery. The vanguards controlled Svadhisthana, while the Embryon held Muladhara. Altogether, the junkyard comprised 7 areas. Foremost among them was Sahasrara, the inviolate territory, which held the headquarters of the church. The gates to the paradise of Nirvana would open themselves to whoever controlled the other 6. So said the church, and therefore it must be true. The Church of Karma was the absolute authority. Muladhara, Svadhisthana, Manipura, Vishuddha, Anahata, Ajna, and inviolate Sahasrara. Sahasrara was where the tower stood, the massive spire inhabited by the church's white-clad warrior priests. At its top were the gates to paradise. The top of the great spire was far, far above the junkyard's bleak expanse, beyond the rain and the dust. From Surf's perspective, it looked blurry and ethereal, as if painted over with watery ink. From that tower, it was said, one could see to the ends of the earth. And right now, on that rubble-strewn battlefield, was something no one had seen before. Weight, unknown. Material, unknown. Object, unknown. Category, error. No matter how many times he scanned it, he got the same result. The object was about 3.5 meters tall and 2 meters across. Its shape was that of a warped sphere, pointed at the top. Its surface consisted of elliptical metal plates, also pointed, reminiscent of the object itself, that overlapped like scales. A pattern of green light occasionally shone between the dull black plates, making the object look as though it were enveloped in some sort of glowing net. Several thick tubes ran out from it along the ground, looking as if they were providing the thing with power of some kind. Light coursed through the tubes, and each time it did, the object quivered in the misty silver rain. It was like some kind of bud, Surf thought, before that unknown bit of code was erased from his mind. Cat. Bud. The noise was really bad today. Warning to the Embryon. A rough voice came echoing through a megaphone. Remove the unidentified object at coordinates 02A7-7B77845 at once. Failure to do so will be considered an act of war, and we will respond with force. Warning to the vanguards. A similar voice replied in the same flat, even tone. Remove the unidentified object at coordinates 02A7-7B77845 at once. Failure to do so will be considered an act of war, and we will respond with force. A call sounded in Surf's ear. The bishop, stationed further back behind the line, transmitted his data analysis. Information began to stream in front of Surf's eyes, but the conclusion was the same. Not even the bishop could crack the mystery of this unknown object. Surf gave a short reply, then ended the call. With his gaze still fixed on the enemy's position, he issued quick orders to his troops via hand signals. Footsteps scurried around behind cover. The female sniper, in shooting position, gave him a quick look. She had pink, shoulder-length hair that made her stand out in the gray light. Soldiers can always be replaced, sir, but we can't replace our leader. He didn't respond. At this point, it hardly warranted acknowledgement. In a conflict between tribes, if one side were to take out the enemy leader, that was the end of it. Even if one tribe were emerging as the clear victor, if their leader fell in battle, they would be declared the losing side on the spot. For a large tribe with sufficient forces, like the solids of Anahata, it was a matter of course that the leader didn't show himself on the front line. But for an up-and-coming tribe like the Embryon, which had far fewer members, the leader was an invaluable presence on the battlefield. It was unprecedented that an upstart tribe like the Embryon had come to control all of Muladhara, a feat that would have been impossible if not for its leader's exceptional abilities and the considerable talents of his 4 core members. Argilla, the woman with the rifle, was one of these 4. She had a remarkable knack for scanning the enemy without needing to use a scope, singling out her target, and dropping her man with a single shot. 2 of Surf's other lieutenants were presently in charge of their own squads, which were stationed to either side of the main formation. The 4th member was the bishop, who would likely bring up the rear once he had finished his data analysis. The fact that the Embryon required its leader and its other core members to engage in personal combat was a weakness, but also a strength. The tribe had only boasted about 50 members when it had taken control of their current area, with that central group of 5 handling the bulk of the fighting all on their own. There probably weren't many other tribes that concentrated that much potential into a mere 5 combatants. Surf drew his handgun from its holster and racked the slide to chamber the first round. The plan was for him to press the attack toward the enemy leader if he turned up on the battlefield. With deft, artful movements, Surf would draw enemy fire in his own direction, hopefully luring out Harley Q himself. In which case, Surf would have his forces attack en masse. If they took out Harley, the battle would be over then and there. Ordinarily, going toe-to-toe with the enemy with only a handgun would be suicide. In this case, however, he wanted to avoid heavier firearms. A larger, longer weapon, such as an assault rifle or machine gun, would be too cumbersome and would impede his ability to dodge incoming fire. For this strategy to work, the person acting as decoy needed to have exceptional judgment, physical prowess, and the ability to defend himself on the battlefield with the smallest weapon possible. The only person who fit all those criteria was the leader of the Embryon himself. Of course, the rules are clear that a leader's death spelled immediate defeat for a tribe. This was why Argilla had cautioned him. But there was another rule to consider as well. Upon a tribe leader's death, the remaining members were required to surrender on the spot and swear their allegiance to the conquering tribe. That was how the Embryon had expanded its own ranks. The same woman who had warned him moments ago would likely wind up serving this other tribe without hesitation if they were victorious. He held up a hand to signal the start of the operation. It had silver eyes, he thought all of a sudden. A cat. It was black, and it had a long tail, big triangle-shaped ears, and needle-like whiskers. That doesn't matter right now. He brought his hand down. The first gunshots rang out. Leaping from behind the concrete wall he'd been using for cover, he charged forward at full sprint, dodging erratically as he ran. Gunfire riddled the ground at his feet. The scent and heat of gunpowder blew past his face. Since he'd outfitted himself to remain as agile as possible, Surf wasn't wearing anything to protect his head. He shielded his eyes with one hand and ducked into a combat roll. The Vanguard's weapons of choice were auto crossbows. Their projectiles didn't have much in the way of penetrative strength, but they were loaded with explosives that would trigger a wide blast upon impact. These explosions could kick up sand and gravel with enough force to maim or kill. He came out of his roll behind some cover, but another attack followed before he could catch his breath. Crossbow bolts rained from above. Even if they didn't score a direct hit, the explosives would do their work. Quickly, he fired off a series of precise shots with his handgun, detonating the bolt at a distance. Dazzling flames engulfed his field of view. As he rolled back out of his hiding place to avoid the explosion, scorched fragments of metal came showering down, and a gust of terrific heat washed over his face, hot enough to raise blisters despite the anti-burn cream he'd applied to his exposed skin. If he had taken the brunt of that blast, he would be a charred, lifeless corpse right now. The scent of burnt hair filled his nostrils. He destroyed another dozen or so arrows that were angling toward him, firing off the last round in his magazine as he somersaulted behind the large piece of rubble he'd set his sights on. A single heartbeat later, flames blossomed above him as an explosive arrow engulfed the whole area in its blast. There was a tremendous boom, followed by a searing rush of air that carried with it the stench of singed asphalt and burnt flesh. A good number of people were probably dead. He slapped a fresh clip into his gun and scanned the area, choosing his next destination. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw enemy soldiers scrambling from behind cover, gunning for him. He responded instinctively with a single shot, not at the enemy, but at yet another explosive bolt coming his way. Deflected and spinning out of control, the projectile careened straight towards the cover the enemy had been using. Direct hit. Screams filled the air. A number of enemy troops stumbled out from behind the shattered concrete, smoke rising from their bodies as they ran. A moment later, however, they staggered in a spray of blood and pitched forward onto the ground. The reports of gunfire followed. Argilla, still crouched at her sniping point, switched to a new clip with practiced ease and resumed firing without delay. In the span of a single breath, every member of the enemy squad lay dead on the ground. A fresh round of intermittent gunfire sounded from Surf's right. A small-statured Embryon soldier with locks of braided blue hair slid down the embankment at the battlefield's edge, firing his submachine gun from the hip in short bursts. The squad he was leading followed close behind. At the same time, another team came rushing down from a position on the opposite side. They were led by a shock trooper, a big man with bright red hair that stood out clearly against the drab landscape. Over one of his broad shoulders, he bore a grenade launcher. He fired it as he ran, belching out a gout of flame. In the ensuing explosion, a number of enemy troops were blasted to cinders. leaving a blackened, smoldering hole in the ground. Across the basin, combatants marked with green and orange clashed in an unruly frenzy. The red-haired man came to a quick stop, keeping the enemy in check with another grenade, backed up by a curtain of submachine gun fire. Surf activated the status tracker function of his augmented vision as he surveyed the battle. The enemy currently had 32 troops. His own side was at 22. Things were going better than anticipated, but given the disparity between their forces, they were taking too long. Even as he checked, another of his men was lost. 21. But there was still no sign of Harley Q. There was a slight time lag when he came out of search mode. As he did, he spotted an enemy soldier clambering over the rubble just half a meter above him. Was the enemy shrugging free of his markings as he made his way close? Surf started to lift his gun into firing position, knowing as he did that he would be too late. He found himself staring back into a pair of wide-open eyes. Surf saw himself reflected in them, a silver-haired young man whose own eyes were open just as wide. An instant later, there was a gunshot from behind him, and the ambusher disappeared from view in a spray of blood and gray matter. Surf reaffirmed the grip on his gun, shot 2 succeeding ambushers right between the eyes, and moved on to his next waypoint. Static crackled through the comlink in his ear. Atop a rise behind Embryon lines, a man lifted his face from behind the scope of his assault rifle. His eyes were a bright blue-green, the same color as the hair underneath his hood. The bishop. I can confirm that Harley Q is present. Use caution, sir. He followed up his transmission with a packet of coordinates. Surf adjusted his scope, switching over to magnification mode to scan the enemy line. A man with reddish hair appeared briefly, moving behind one of the containers. The scope snapped a still image, enlarged it, and then further enhanced it. Blurry lines were cleared up, revealing the silhouette of a thin man with a striking profile. There were green markings at his shoulders and beneath his eyes. It was enough to confirm a match between the current image and the one on file. Harley Q himself. Surf had acquired his target. Now it was simply a matter of finding the right way to lure him out into the open. He waited for a break in the enemy assault, trying to determine the best possible route to take. Then suddenly, the battlefield was bathed in a blinding white light.
Light